Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir?
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was, but I wanted to get his confirmation.
May I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
They immediately suppress it, and they say, this is something we can't discuss in the open.
Security, yes.
The people aren't allowed to know about this.
Yeah.
And that's why, who protected this information, who protected Oliver North? The head Democrat, which goes to show you the power structure is the same.
With respect to Brooks challenging North or asking him about these residual standby plans, which have been in existence for some time, but which are more proximate to us today as a result of a national security advisory that President Reagan signed in May of 1984, and which of course is by its very nature under the coverage of security, and you could be hauled up and brought in by the FBI and charged with espionage if you were to reveal any knowledge as to the exact content of that document. But there's no question that it was patterned after what was talked about during the Watergate crisis. At that time, there were standby powers. General Haig at that time was the one in which there were such things seriously discussed as the suspension of the national elections in 1974, or rather 72. If there were turbulence and disorder throughout the country that would prevent an orderly process, well, who's going to determine that? Once you do that, then it's possible to invoke such things as military.
If the American people knew how loose this has become, I mean, you always need scenarios for a disaster. Right. And you know, our government would be ill-serving us if they didn't prepare these scenarios. But when you bring into these scenarios domestic dissent as a provocateur of this being implemented, then we're talking about a level of political repression that I don't think Congress would tolerate if the people knew about it. But they don't know about it because, of course, it's a matter of national security that we don't talk about it, therefore we got to trust them. Well, trust them? I mean, they don't have a very good track record in some of these agencies for trust.
Or why would a government be against civil liberties? It's hard to imagine that they would assault, you know, our very Constitution, our very basic liberties.
This is not just an attack on the constitutional protections of the rights, the emancipated peoples and of the peoples of color. This is an attack on every single constitutional right of every person. The right not to have your home broken into, the right not to be stopped on a highway and searched and frisked without a warrant, the violations of the Fourth Amendment, the protections of the First Amendment, the protections of the right to counsel. They have a conscious effort to weaken and undermine every one of these rights. And what is beginning to develop, and people are beginning to see this, the power structure, not only in the government, but in the big corporations, they are very frightened. And what are they frightened at? That millions and millions of people in this country are angry and suffering from the most elementary problems that they have, which are not being solved. One of the most shocking examples, and I'm sure you have some of this down here in Texas, I've been at many meetings all through the Midwest, of whom the family farmers And hundreds of thousands of family farmers are facing what? The worst crisis in their lives, the farm mortgage foreclosure crisis, in which the big banks are coming in, and they're open about it. They've decided that we don't need family farms any longer in this country, that we must have what is known as what? Corporate agriculture.
Right.
And they will be destroyed. All right, the family farmers, and we must understand this, they are not long-haired radicals.
Right.
They are what we've always known as the heart of Middle America. And what are they saying? They're in meetings all over. They are furious. And why? Because they went to the White House. They demanded what? What their grandparents got from a certain president known as Franklin Roosevelt. The first thing, and I was a youngster at that time, I didn't even remember this, but I'll never forget an older farmer saying this to me at a meeting in Kansas, that his father had told him that the first thing that Franklin Roosevelt had done when he was elected was to sign a presidential decree declaring a 4-year moratorium on farm foreclosures,
Right.
giving the family farmers a
Right.
chance to move forward, and they were saved. All right, they went to Washington during the Reagan period, and then again this year of the Bush administration, and you know what they were told by Reagan and Bush? Go home. We don't have any right to interfere with banks. We don't have any right, we don't have any power to do this. So the family farmers are furious, and what are they looking for? For the first time, they want to work together with what? Millions of people, and many of them across the state line from them, who are facing what? The crisis of plant closings. Hundreds of thousands, millions of American people,
Workers.
working people, and many of them white working people, many of them people of color, are faced with devastation. And I don't have to tell you folks down here. You take a look, you go into anywhere along the Ohio River, for example, where the steel plants were first developed, and you go into some of these cities, and what does it look like? London looked like after the bombings in World War II, because the plants are all closed down, and the business people, the small business people are destroyed. There's no market, and they're furious, and they're trying to come together, and what are they demanding? Very elementary demand. If these companies close our plants, we must have the right to run them ourselves. We must have the right to take them over. And the state of Pennsylvania, as a result of this pressure from the majority of its people, passed a bill setting up a plant closing agency that had the power, under, again, a technical legal word that nobody understands, called eminent domain.
Right.
Coming from where? Coming from the Middle Ages in England.
Right.
That a town has the power to take over property which injures the interests of the people of the town. And they want to take it over, and what are the big corporations doing? They're going into court, and they're charging that what? This is Bolshevism. This is un-Americanism. We have the right not only to own a plant, to close a plant. Period. All right, so the family farmers are saying, we can't win by ourselves. It's true. The plant closing people can't win by themselves, the working people, the union people. But if we get together, we have a fighting chance. And then what are they saying? We want to get together. And they've asked for meetings now, and this is making American history, meetings with representatives of the black movements all through the South who are facing, as folks all through the South know,
Homelessness,
poverty, and redistricting, losing the right to vote. Then you take, in the urban areas of the North, what's the most serious problems? I don't know whether you have it down here.
Drugs.
Housing. Homelessness. And then the drug crisis from one end of the country to the other. So people getting together. Take the women's movement. Women are furious. Because what? The same Supreme Court in June came down with a decision which put the knife in to what had been decided in Roe against Wade as the fundamental right of women to make decisions over their own lives, their own bodies, the right to abortion. And so the women are saying, we've got to do something about this. And not only the right to abortion, the right of women not to have sexual harassment in a job.
Right, right.
Which, I don't have to tell you folks, that's one of the most current phenomena in our society, that women have this experience in factories and in employment and everything else. So if you add together all of these groups, and they unite to fight for what? All kinds of radical changes, nonsense, to fight for their immediate
Survival.
needs, survival, what will that mean? And the folks in the power structure, the industrial military complex, and that's not a radical term. You know who that was first
Dwight
used by?
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower.
Right. Yeah.
First used that term, all right? If all of these folks come together and fight for their immediate needs, then the power of the industrial military complex is threatened. And we will have a change. We have a new type of government, a new type of government representing the needs and interests of the people. And the power structure is scared to death about this.
Right.
And that's why they are saying that, what do these people do? They'll use these elementary constitutional rights to organize. They'll use it to come together. They'll use it to fight for their rights. Therefore, a moment has come when we have to get rid of these rights. And what are they putting forward? And I lived through this in the Nixon period because I was thrown right into this fight in the Supreme Court of the United States. Little concept known as what? The inherent power of the President of the United States to suspend the Constitution or any provisions thereof or any laws of the government when he decides it's in the national interest to do so. And they're putting that forward once again?
That what happened is that they simply, now that they had the power to implement this on a national scale, they did so. Through, primarily through the Federal Emergency Management Administration with a series of steps that were first rejected, I might add, under Nixon. Some of these theories were first promulgated under Nixon and first promulgated when Reagan first came to office, and Congress rejected the packages of legislation. What has happened, however, is that almost every single element of this repressive apparatus that was first scenariized in California has been passed into law by Congress on a piecemeal basis, so that you have change of authority set up and structures set up and detention camps set up and plans for, instead of the National Guard reporting to the governor of the state, the National Guard now becomes militarized. The establishment of these state defense forces, which are nothing more than sort of armed vandals of our society being empowered to enforce the law. What a great idea! You know, every gun nut in America now is part of the strategic, this state defense force movement.
And they're being organized.
And they're being organized and trained.
So, loonies, the craziest people in the Reagan administration were involved in formulating these plans, and we still don't even know.
Well, but see, now, interestingly enough, given the way society functions, a lot of these people were moved out. They sort of lost a power struggle for control of this apparatus, in part because some people in government thought they were too lunatic.
Right.
That's the good news. The bad news is the apparatus remains, and it's in somebody's hands, and we don't know who really now is the agency or agencies or administrators who are in fact in control of this apparatus that has been set up. What's important to know is that the apparatus exists. It still exists today, and therefore we are dependent on the goodwill of who is at the controls of this apparatus.
But it's no longer in FEMA. Gio Frida was forced to resign.
He was forced to resign
in 1985.
Over power struggle over this very issue.
But FEMA still exists. Whenever there's the earthquake or the floods.
Well, they don't do a very good job with earthquakes and floods, you'll notice.
But you saw them on the news.
Yeah.
I had some of my students do some research into FEMA, so they went through databases.
You noticed how their funding works, how much is for natural disaster and how much is for just sort of stuff.
Right. It was only a small percentage.
Small percentage is for natural disaster. Right.
So, but is it certain that they no longer have these secret plans? Or was
they still have the plans. There's still, the structure within FEMA exists, but the people who were running the show, like Frida, have been moved out, and it's not clear whether it's NSC or a bizarre department of the Veterans Administration because of National Guard and Reserve duty, or it's not clear if it's in the Pentagon. I mean, it's sort of like, somebody robbed a bank and took the money, and they caught the bank robbers and put them in jail, but no one's going to tell you where the money is. It's like they've dealt with half the problem. They got rid of the people who designed the system, but somebody's still in control of the system, and that's what we have to find out. And people like Dr. Reynolds and others are trying to unravel that now, and it's a difficult task because, of course, national security doesn't allow you to.
Someone needs to blow the whistle.
Someone needs to blow the whistle here.
Say where it's gone and what the plans are.
Right. We know they're still there. We just don't know who's running the show. So.
Interesting.
Well, there are also a lot of these things could be dealt with through national security directives, which are secret.
Now, what they are setting up is a new bevy of laws, 15 or so, but there's more than 15. National laws, Supreme Court precedents, programs being prepared that will create a new situation in the next war, so that the public will not have the full access to the truth of what's happening. And then so that dissidents can be controlled, so that people can't make their political weight felt by taking to the streets, by demonstrating. Some of these, just to mention a few of them, for example, you have the Marchetti and Snepp rulings of the Supreme Court, which gives the government the right to censor books before publication. In the Snepp case, they didn't accuse him of revealing any secrets. They just claimed that he had an unauthorized disclosure of the government's activities. And for that, they took away $100,000 from him in a civil suit.
Even though it was even unclassified.
Even though it was unclassified and there were no secrets involved.
And now a broader range of government employees is under these restrictions.
Oh yeah, the Morrison, the criminal case against Morrison, who leaked some information to Jane's weapon systems, they're going after this guy under the espionage law. And if they get this, if President Reagan gets this, anybody who talks to the press in Washington could be jailed for espionage. Another one is the Phil Agee passport ruling, in which the Supreme Court supported the State Department. The Secretary of State now has the authority to take away any American citizen's passport without a hearing. It means that in the next war, a Jane Fonda going to Hanoi, a Cy Hirsch covering My Lai, they'll just lose their passports, and My Lai won't be exposed. Another law that they're putting together, which is as ominous as you can get, is this preemptive strikes against terrorists. Secretary Shultz is defending this thing, saying, yes, it will be necessary to take action on the basis of information that would never stand up in court, and yes, innocent people will be hurt in the process. This bill also provides for the Secretary of State to put together a list of terrorists, of suspected terrorists, of terrorist supporters.
Just on his own word.
And
Nobody
if
else's.
your name or your organization is on the list, you would not be permitted to go to court and challenge it and have your name taken off the list. So the Secretary of State pins your name on his list, and legally they can kick in your door and kill you. They've got the teams put together to do the preemptive striking, international SWAT teams.
The State Department and all have actually said who they claim in the United States are some of these terrorists. This includes people who are supportive of the freeze, people who are against nuclear power plants,
CSPIS, this lobby group on
people
Central
who
America.
people who support the refugees coming up from El Salvador, anybody who is supportive, who is non-supportive of the administration view of Central America. That's millions of people.
Another one is the NERP, the National Emergency Reaction Plan, that Reagan started working on shortly after he set people up, streamlining the National Guard Command, so it can be called out more quickly in times of civil disorder, a la Kent State. And then there's FEMA. There's a lot of laws, and you can sort out 15, you can sort out others.
That includes executive orders too.
Right. Yeah, executive orders is one way of coming up with a law. Bills passed through Congress is another way. Supreme Court decisions, another way, and all these things are happening. And then just the policy.
Frank Wilkinson, who was jailed for a year for refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee, he tells us about a shocking threat to our civil liberties.
Preventive detention wipes out the foundation of the whole criminal justice system in our country, which is based upon the concept of the presumption of innocence. In America, when you're charged with a crime, you're presumed innocent until the jury has found you guilty. For that reason, our Eighth Amendment gives you bail so you can defend yourself. Judges will deny bail in certain capital cases possibly, or in cases where there's reason to believe a flight from the jurisdiction. But generally you get bail. All right, Kennedy's bill provides that an arresting police officer or FBI agent on a non-capital, not even an injury case, but it could be any one of a number of what I call a civil disobedience type of statutes, or recidivists who constantly protest nuclear power plants or civil rights actions, doing it, is arrested. And the arresting officer takes you before the judge for arraignment and says to the judge, Your Honor, I ask that you deny bail. This man or this woman is dangerous. That's the only word used. At that point, under Kennedy's bill, the judge locks you up for 5 days while you prove that you're not dangerous. And how do you prove you're not dangerous if you're already locked up allegedly on suspicion of violating some law? After 5 days, based on hearsay evidence that would never be accepted in a court of law, the judge then can deny you bail, and you're locked up. You're locked up pending trial. It's an Alice in Wonderland type of justice, where the Queen of Hearts said, "Sentence now, trial later," whatever that was, you know, in the Lewis Hart book. And that is happening. Now that is law now, and the horrible irony is that it's to be compared with something that's going on to uphold apartheid in South Africa.
These seem to be pretty serious things. Now, you have a historical perspective of what the United States has done in the Civil War, in World War I, World War II. How does this stack up with things that have happened in the past?
It pales everything else. It's beyond everything else. If we go back to what American school children still hear about as an unfortunate thing in American history that was corrected, you know, and so that everything is okay ever since. The Third Alien Act of July 1798 provided that the President of the United States, in the event of a declared war, and the war would have been declared against France, the President then could arrest, imprison, and banish aliens from the homeland of the country with which the United States was making war. Okay, it had to be war declared, and the abuse, the disregard of the rights of aliens only from the country in belligerency. And it was never invoked. Nobody was touched by that action because of a storm of protest.
Now, Henry Gonzalez said that if there is a formal declaration of law, all of these of war, that all of these acts, like the 1918 Sedition Act and the Espionage Act of 1917, they would automatically come back into effect.
I think he's in error. There were 4 major laws made during World War I. The 2 you mentioned, and then one called the Sabotage Act, which made it a crime against the war interests of the United States to stop working, which is to say, to participate in a strike.
Right.
And then there was a 4th final sweeping Alien Act, in which not just Germans, but any aliens could be put in jail if they were suspect, and chiefly suspect of anarchism. Now, I don't think those laws can be re-invoked. They weren't in World War II. That's why the Smith Act was written. But what we have here is a record of preparing for war by preparing to make a kind of war against our own people. In the U.S. Constitution, every alien has every protection that we citizens have. And these laws suspended that, and those laws have been held constitutional.
And this FEMA stuff isn't just against aliens, it's against everybody.
Anybody. Now, if you go down to the Smith Act of 1940, the Alien Registration Act, no time of war, all right? It's because of a situation in which war may become likely. Any alien of any nationality can be detained or deported for any suspicious action to the safety of the United States. That's getting more extreme, but at least the context is war is likely. Now we have, and in 1940 there was not a politician in the United States who, when he thought of the word war in connection with the United States, did not assume a congressional debate and a vote to declare war. Now there isn't a politician who thinks that any such debate is plausible anymore. That's a great, regrettable change. The Emergency Detention Act of 1950, which is part of the so-called McCarran Act, absented the condition of war altogether. It was for an emergency to be declared by the presidency. Those emergencies included a declaration of war or invasion or insurrection of in the United States, or threat of insurrection in the United States. And then anybody, alien or naturalized, could be incarcerated on suspicion that that person would conspire to commit an act. So it's no overt acts even.
And the president could just declare the situation just on his own. He didn't have to get approval or anything.
Yes, the American president vetoed that act and it passed over his veto. It has since been repealed in 1971, but for all we know, given the clandestine character of so many operations, it's incorporated into this present act for preparing for an emergency.
Well, even at that, there was a study made in the early 70s after the act was supposedly repealed, and the concentration camps which they'd set up were still in a caretaker status.
And some of those were the ones prepared for the Japanese, 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. During World War I, there were severe measures, the Espionage Acts and the Sedition Acts, which didn't have anything to do with espionage. They had to do with criticism of the U.S. government.
And don't forget that there's plenty of precedent of the government jailing anti-war dissidents. 30,000 people jailed in the Civil War for protesting the war. 6,000 jailed in World War I for protesting the war. Remember Kate Richards O'Hare saying the women of the United States are nothing but brood sows producing sons to be put into the army to be turned into fertilizer, and she was sentenced to 5 years in jail for anti-war talk.
We do have to remember, in all justice and candor, that much of the repression which has occurred in this country has been popular. That is, the population has supported it. And it was assured by its government that it was justified and, in fact, necessary for the preservation of American values. And the American people have always rested uneasily with that. They've regretted each Red Scare, at least to some extent. But for a while it's been popular, and the Constitution is there in part to protect those of us who are going to say something that our countrymen don't want to hear. We're supposed to be able to say it. And these government programs have been designed to crush us if we've tried.
And what's at stake is freedom. The freedoms that we have sometimes inaccurately boasted about, but freedom, the system of democracy itself. There are cynical people in the world, including in this country, who are quite happy to take away your freedom if you'll let them do it. And this is what's at stake right now.
What the American people must never forget is that when fascism comes to America, it will come wrapped in an American flag. And that's something that I have never forgotten, because that's the problem that we face today. And we have to be very open about this. What are we facing? We're facing the road to fascism. And when we understand that, millions and millions of American people will stand up and will fight for the elementary preservation of the American system of government.
And that brings us to the end of this Alternative Views. Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. That same address is one which you can use to write us on any subject. As a matter of fact, Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.